As the 1970s rolled around, it was violence and theft as usual for Tommy DeSimone and his cohorts. In June of 1970, an incident involving a man alleged to be a made man in the Gambino family named William Bentvena, known as Billy Bats, would be a tale inextricably linked to Tommy DeSimone. The encounter between the two was made famous in the scene in Goodfellas, where Billy Bats, played by Frank Vincent, insults Tommy by telling him to get his shine box.
Hey, Tommy, if I was gonna break your balls, I'd tell you to go home and get your shine box.
However, the movie scene differs from reality in a few ways. William Joseph Bentvena was born in Rockaway, Queens, then later moved with his parents to Valley Stream, Long Island, and had been involved in loan sharking and drug dealing from a young age. He was arrested in a large heroin ring bust on February 14, 1959, when he was 25 years old. Then was a defendant in a major narcotics case in the early 60s, along with numerous other mobsters, including the ruthless and powerful Bonanno family underboss Carmine Galante. Bentvena was sent to prison for several years, and during this time, Jimmy Burke muscled in on his loan sharking operation. Bentvena was portrayed by the 53-year-old Frank Vincent, who was significantly older than William Bentvena was at that time. Bentvena was born on February 22, 1933, which would make him 37 years old when the encounter with DeSimone took place. As told in Wise Guy, after Bentvena was released from prison in 1970, he was throwing a welcome home party at Robert's Lounge, which once stood right here behind me. There he encountered DeSimone and jokingly asked him if he still shined shoes, which infuriated the tightly wound up DeSimone. But unlike the scene in Goodfellas, this didn't result in immediate retribution from Tommy. Hill claims that after the slight, Tommy whispered in his ear that he was going to kill him. It was a few weeks later when Bentvena was at Henry Hill's night spot, the Sweet Lounge, which once stood right here behind me on Queens Boulevard in the Forest Hills section of Queens. When Tommy spotted him in the suite, he left to retrieve a gun and a body bag. When Tommy returned, only a few people were left in the bar, which included Bentvena, Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, their crew member Alex Corcione, and his girlfriend. As stated in Wise Guy and depicted in this scene, Tommy had approached the drunken Bentvena, who was conversing with Burke at the time, and began smashing his face and head with a gun as he was held by Burke. What this scene leaves out is that Alex Corcione, who was still in the bar, had approached the melee, but was threatened by Burke, and Hill ordered him and his girlfriend out of the bar. Bentvena was seriously beaten until it was assumed he was dead. His lifeless body was thrown into the trunk of a car, where Hill, Burke, and DeSimone drove upstate where they planned to bury him. When they heard sounds coming from the trunk, they realized that Bentvena was still alive. Then they opened the trunk and finished him off with a tire iron and shovel. Afterwards, they headed to a dog kennel where they finally buried Bentvena. Unlike how it's portrayed in the movie, Bentvena wasn't killed because of his slight towards Tommy, but rather that Burke didn't want to forfeit his loan sharking operations, which he took over while he was in prison. As the movie does correctly state, made men in the mafia are not to be killed unless it's sanctioned by their superiors. Otherwise, they themselves will be subject to death. However, it should be noted that it's debatable whether William Bentvena was actually a made man. There's a rule in place that in order to become a made man in the mafia, both of your parents have to either be Sicilian or Italian. Yet William Bentvena's mother was an immigrant from Ireland named Alice Fulham. Additionally, in 1957, the mafia closed the books, which means they stopped allowing people to be formally inducted into families up until 1976. So that means Bentvena would have had to have been in his early 20s when he was made, which was a rare occurrence. There's also some speculation that if Bats was made, that he bought his membership into the family. Before it was the Gambino family, it was the Anastasia family under boss Albert Anastasia, and Anastasia's underboss, Frank Scalise, had been selling memberships into the family, which he was killed for in June of 1957. Nobody was ever charged with Bentvena's murder, and his body has never been found. There's another famous story told in Wise Guy and portrayed in Goodfellas, which raises some questions about its authenticity. Hill tells a story about a young man nicknamed Spider, who worked as a bartender at their after-hours gambling spot in the basement of Robert's Lounge. Spider was allegedly the nickname of a man named Michael Gianco and was played by Michael Imperioli of later Sopranos fame. As this scene depicts, DeSimone was annoyed at Spider for passing him over on a drink order and told him to dance by shooting at his feet and accidentally shot him in the foot. Hill says he was taken to the neighborhood doctor by a Bonanno family associate named Vincent Asaro. As Hill tells it in Wise Guy and is portrayed in this scene, a few weeks later, Spider had returned to his role as a bartender at Robert's Lounge with bandages on his foot, and Tommy ordered him to dance again. Spider responded by cursing him out, to which Tommy responded by shooting him dead in the bar. Burke was said to be enraged by this and ordered Tommy to bury him on his own. According to Hill, after Spider was killed, Tommy buried him right there in the basement of Robert's Lounge. But there are some problems with the story of Spider. Authorities later investigated his murder, but there are no records, not even a birth certificate for a man named Michael Gianco, and a man fitting his description was never reported missing. Furthermore, no one from the neighborhood where Hill said Gianco lived and worked had ever heard of him. The remains of this individual have never been found, and the case is classified as unsolved. It's possible that Hill may have altered the details of the story and changed the name of the victim, or maybe even based it off of an entirely different murder, while there's others who question if the incident ever really happened. On October 5th, 1970, Tommy was arrested in Queens on a warrant from Jersey City, New Jersey, and was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, hijacking, and criminal possession of stolen property. These charges stem from a string of crimes in New Jersey and Queens, including the murder of a union representative in Jersey City named William Reckow, for which his associate Stanley Diamond was also charged. Tommy and Diamond would both later be acquitted of the murder charges. Tommy was supposed to head to Tampa, Florida with Jimmy Burke to confront a man named Gaspar Ciaccio, who had fallen heavily in debt to Burke, but due to Tommy's arrest, he was replaced by Henry. On October 8, 1970, Hill, Burke, and several others had visited Ciaccio at a bar he owned named the Temple Terrace Lounge. Then they abducted him and severely beat him, which this scene in Goodfellas is loosely based on, although Ciaccio was never brought to the zoo and held over a lion's enclosure. As the movie does factually state, Ciaccio's sister did work for the FBI and she informed authorities of what occurred. The following month, Burke, Hill, and several others were arrested and hit with numerous charges related to the incident, including extortion, kidnapping, and gambling, and Burke and Hill were released on bail. Sometime in 1972, Tommy was hospitalized for a week in order to receive treatment for a deviated septum. He told authorities it was from the result of an accident while trying to fix a light bulb. But one could assume the real cause of that condition. Heavy cocaine usage can damage the nasal septum by weakening its tissue, leading to deviated septums and the appearance of a crooked nose. Tommy was also diagnosed with an ulcer, another possible symptom of his heavy cocaine and alcohol use. Throughout 1972, Captain Paul Vario was subject to numerous investigations and had ongoing legal issues. In early 1973, he was sentenced to 6 months in county jail for violating probation. Then on April 6, 1973, he was sentenced to 6 years for income tax evasion and was sent off to Lewisburg Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. On October 10, 1973, a funeral was held at St. Fortunata's Church in Brooklyn for Paul Vario's 27-year-old son Lenny, who had passed away due to injuries he suffered in a building explosion a year earlier. When an NBC News cameraman tried to film the event, Tommy and Paul Vario's brother Vito, as well as a third person, assaulted the cameraman and broke his camera. A police officer who was present tried to intervene but was pushed by DeSimone. Then DeSimone punched another police officer a short time later. He then ran through the church and escaped through the back, but he surrendered to authorities a week later and was charged with second-degree assault. Tommy was running with several gangsters connected to the Gambinos, including Ronald Jerothe, nicknamed Foxy. Foxy was known as a street-smart, tough guy who was good with his fists. He came from the same East New York neighborhood as John Gotti, and the two were close with one another. Foxy was adopted by his mother's husband as a child and was said to be of Irish and Italian descent. Foxy had his hand in several different rackets and was well respected by his peers and known as a good earner. Together, Tommy and Foxy were doing mail truck scores as well as gold heists at the JFK airport. They were also partners in the coke and heroin business and became good friends.
DeSimone was often seen by law enforcement hanging out with several individuals at the Q Motor Inn in Kew Gardens, Queens, one of which was Angelo Ruggiero, who was with the Gambino family and a close ally to John Gotti, as well as Joseph Spione, a Lucchese associate who was a partner of Tommy's. Known as Joe the Barber, he was a stick-up man, bookmaker, and drug dealer who worked out of a barber shop in Queens and would soon become Tommy's brother-in-law. By now, Tommy's older brother Robert, nicknamed Skinny Bobby due to his tall and slim stature, was an associate of the Gambino family and was based in South Florida. There, he was part of a crew that included Thomas Agro, a Gambino soldier who ran big bookmaking and gambling operations and divided his time between New York and Florida. Also part of the crew was Joseph Iannuzzi, nicknamed Joe Dogs. In Florida, Bobby got involved in various different rackets for the Gambinos. Tommy also made frequent trips to Florida where he would attend different mob hangouts with his brother and associates, including the Nightlife Club in Oakland Park and Hemingway's in Hollywood. Joseph Iannuzzi, who later became an FBI informant, details his dealings with Bobby DeSimone in his 1993 book Joe Dogs, The Life and Crimes of a Mobster. Iannuzzi describes Bobby as a knockaround guy who spoke too much and didn't quite fit the mold of a wise guy.
Iannuzzi claims that Tommy's other brother Anthony was also a mobster who was involved with the Gambinos. However, there's one problem with that. Tommy didn't have a brother named Anthony. In Iannuzzi's book, he claims that he got, quote, Bobby's youngest brother Anthony a job in the early 70s, even though Tommy was the youngest child. It's unknown where the name Anthony came from, and there's no mentions in any official documentation of a man named Anthony DeSimone as being involved in organized crime at that time. Although Tommy's brother Roland, who was 3 years older than him, may have had some criminal involvement with his brothers. The oldest DeSimone sibling, Francis Frank DeSimone, avoided a life of crime and later in life relocated to Alabama with his wife and kids, where he worked in the public school bus system. On June 21st, 1973, Tommy, Jimmy Burke, and one other person stuck up a cargo truck which contained 1,200 ladies' knit tops. He stole the license of the truck driver and threatened violence against him and his family if he spoke to anyone, yet he also gave him $50 for his trouble. 5 days later, the truck was found with DeSimone's fingerprints on it. Burke and Hill were acquitted of their kidnapping and attempted murder charges, but both would be convicted of extortion and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Due to numerous appeals, it took over 2 years for Hill to be sentenced for his conviction, and he was sent to prison in 1974.
Hill said he paid off an assignment officer $200 to send him to Lewisburg so he could join other Lucchese mobsters who were imprisoned there, which included Paul Vario, as well as Johnny Dio, a big-time labor racketeer. Lewisburg was a preferred place for mobsters to do time, as there was an area in the jail known as Mafia Row, due to the amount of mobsters locked up there and the special privileges they received. Burke, on the other hand, would soon be sent to do his time at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary.
In February of 1974, Tommy's father, Robert, passed away at the age of 66. And soon after, Tommy got a tattoo on his right bicep which said, "In memory of Pop." On May 1st, 1974, customs agents arrested Tommy for the hijacking that he took part in with Burke the previous year. Authorities spotted him at Robert's lounge and he was arrested and released on a $22,000 and $500 surety bond. On October 8, 1974, both Tommy and Jimmy were indicted for possession of stolen property through interstate shipment, as well as aiding and abetting for their hijacking of a truck of furs in 1969. Burke was arrested in Las Vegas and returned to New York, while Tommy turned himself in 2 days later and was released on a surety bond. In December of 1974, Tommy moved back to his childhood home to live with his mother and sister. Tommy wasn't exactly making a lucrative living as a gangster. His earnings mainly came from mid-level drug dealing, thefts, and sporadic rackets. And then he had to kick up to his superiors and split with his partners. Not to mention all the money that was going towards his legal costs as well as his drug habit. When all was said and done, Tommy was left with modest earnings at best. In late 1974, Tommy allegedly infuriated his partner Foxy Jerothe over a dispute involving a woman that Tommy had been sleeping with. Exactly who that woman was is a topic of contention. Some say it was Foxy's sister, while others say it was a woman that Foxy was dating. What is known is that after this infraction, Foxy threatened to kill Tommy, and when Tommy heard about this, he decided to confront Foxy first.
Sometime in December, Anthony Stabile drove Tommy to Foxy's home in the Howard Beach neighborhood of Queens. After Foxy opened the door, he punched Tommy in the mouth. Tommy dropped to the floor, then as he rose, he pulled out his gun and shot Foxy in the face. Foxy Jerothe died right there in his apartment, and DeSimone was driven off by Stabile. People were surprised to hear this, as Tommy and Foxy were considered good friends. Foxy also had a good reputation with his partners, so after his murder, Angelo Seppi and several others had a sit-down with Tommy. Subsequently, they ceased providing protection for him due to the repercussions stemming from Foxy's murder. DeSimone's out-of-control actions had created tension with mobsters in and out of his family, and led to his once close associates to distance themselves from him.
In the 2004 book Gangsters and Goodfellas, which is also based on information by Henry Hill and considered a sequel to Wise Guy, Hill says that Tommy feared being on the streets without his top guys to protect him. So Hill says that Tommy had his bail revoked so he could be sent to Lewisburg to join them. However, that couldn't have happened. Lewisburg is a federal penitentiary where people are sent after they are convicted of crimes, not while they're out on bail awaiting trial. On January 4th, 1975, just a few weeks after the murder of Foxy Jerothe, Tommy got married in Maryland. Some sources say that his wife was the sister of his partner Joe Spione. In Wise Guy, Hill states that Tommy's wife is named Angela and nicknamed Cookie. However, there's no mention of who she's related to or what her last name is, and there's no records of any woman named Angela Spione. In an FBI note, it's mentioned that the woman that Tommy married was actually the woman that Foxy Jerothe was killed over. Tommy's wife moved in with him to his childhood home and soon got pregnant and then gave birth to his second child. But even while Tommy was married, he never quite settled down and maintained a slew of mistresses throughout his life. Just 3 days after his wedding, on January 7th, 1975, FBI agents took Tommy into custody as he was leaving the courthouse on a separate matter.
In June of 1974, a tractor-trailer carrying 960 cases of cigarettes was hijacked in Stevens City, Virginia, and driven to New Jersey, where the driver was released. The driver was later shown a picture of Tommy DeSimone and identified him as being one of the hijackers. A week after his arrest, he was indicted on an interstate theft charge. On June 29, 1975, Tommy's close associate, Joe Spione, had married his sister, Phyllis. The reception was held at the Terrace on the Park in Flushing Meadows, Queens, and was attended by numerous mobsters. On March 17, 1975, DeSimone, Burke, and 6 others went on trial for theft and hijacking charges. The first trial ended in a hung jury, and a retrial was set for August. The retrial resulted in a mistrial. A third trial was ordered, and that trial ended in a hung jury. The DA declined to pursue another trial, and the charges were dismissed.
However, during this period, Tommy was on trial for his other hijacking charge. He was convicted on April 11, 1975, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was sent to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to join Vario and Hill.
Also locked up at Lewisburg during this time were Colombo and Gambino mobsters Sal Polisi and Angelo Ruggiero.
While at Lewisburg, he was frequently visited by Jimmy Burke and his wife Frances. In Gangsters and Goodfellas, Hill states that he witnessed Tommy commit several murders while at Lewisburg. However, this is another claim that can't be backed up with any evidence.
In June of 1977, Bobby DeSimone and his 22-year-old son Robert DeSimone III were involved in a shootout with DEA agents in Hollywood, Florida, during an undercover drug buy of 1 pound of cocaine. Bobby shot and wounded one of the officers and was hit by return fire and struck in the ankle. Claiming he was acting in defense of his son, Bobby would later be acquitted of the charges. Soon after that, Robert DeSimone III was arrested with several others for attempting to smuggle a plane load of 9,000 pounds of marijuana into Alabama and was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
In Wise Guy, Hill states that Tommy was always living down the fact that one of his brothers was killed for being an informant. However, there's more confusion surrounding this. In Joe Dogg's book, he claims that Tommy's supposed brother Anthony was killed for ratting, and the one to kill him was none other than his own brother Bobby's partner in Florida, Thomas Agro. Although Tommy didn't have a brother named Anthony, records do show that his brother Roland Michael DeSimone died in June of 1975 at the age of 31, although there's no information to confirm if his death was the result of a murder related to organized crime. Henry Hill served about 4 years of his 10-year sentence and was released in July of 1978. Upon his return from jail, Hill got involved in narcotics dealings and was also abusing alcohol and cocaine. Tommy served 3.5 years of his 10-year sentence and was released to a halfway house in Manhattan on October 18, 1978. There, Jimmy Burke was also finishing out his sentence, and soon both of them would be back to crime as usual. By now, Tommy's actions had repelled many of those close to him, and several people were eager to exact revenge on him. He had killed a valued Gambino associate in Foxy Jerothe and was also suspected of killing William Billy Bats Benvina 8 years earlier.
Tommy DeSimone was back on the streets, but his clock was ticking.